Welcome to another episode of Hustlers Connect. Today, we have with us Jay Krishnan, the founder and creative director of Applied Wonder. Applied Wonder is a creative agency that specializes in behavior change campaigns. Jay has worked on a range of social issues like participative democracy, organic food, violence against women, microfinance, mental health, fair trade, etc. One of the rare behavior change experts with the capacity to conceptualize pure play creative ideas that are based on scientific behavior change levers. He has been the chief creative mind behind some of the most globally acclaimed behavior change campaigns like Super Amma, Mom's Magic Hand, and others. Welcome to the fifth episode of Hustlers Connect. Hustlers Connect is a passion project that Thanmay and I started to have compelling conversations with outliers among us. We are more interested in what makes people who they are today. And we believe that it is a function of their past experiences and learnings. And that's the basic intent of this podcast. And I have been waiting very long to have this conversation with you. It's been almost 3 years that I have waited, and finally we are getting this chance to do it, and I can't be more excited about it. So, thank you to come on the show.
Thanks so much, Akshay. I think we've been planning this for several years, one pandemic in between, and a lot of missed opportunities.
Right.
Super happy to be here. And normally you don't get a chance to look back at your life and how things evolved. You just take it on, pretty much running on water as it comes.
Right.
So, pretty happy to be here and reflect on things with you.
So, a poet, a cartoonist, animator, behavior change expert. Please take me through this journey from being a BSc mathematics graduate to a behavior change expert. Where did it start?
So, I think the thing is, whatever illuminates your creativity, it's one source code. And that manifests whether it's in writing or whether it's in illustration or whether you're thinking of campaigns. But essentially, there's one common thing that you draw from. And therefore, initially I started out writing poetry, and that was where the nascent creativity developed. So pretty much in my childhood, so my eldest sister, she was somebody who was a poetess and she was a sociologist. I kind of grew up in a space where there was a lot of poetry and creativity and art. So, I could absorb those things. In some sense, it kind of filled up my consciousness right from the time I was a child. So I aspired to be creative and I appreciated creativity. And in fact, when I was very little, I was pretty sickly, and my mom kind of homeschooled me till I was in third. So I spent large parts of my childhood just lingering, wandering about, stumbling on books, drawing, picking up things and tinkering with it, kind of unsupervised. So very fertile leisure. So what that does is, you're by yourself, you're introspective, and you're in this space that's very tranquil, and it's got a lot of creative possibilities and a lot of stimulus. So when my mom would be in the kitchen doing her own thing, my siblings would be away at school, dad away at work, I had this cocoon for myself. And there was this attic which had literally several generations of books. So my grandfather's books, my mom's books, and so very disparate in nature, which meant to say that as a kid, if you tumbled into this, there could be anything from Marvel comics to Macbeth. So it's a wide spectrum, and you stumble and discover and interpret at your own pace because it's unsupervised. And I think that's two things that are a prerequisite for creativity, which is leisure for introspection and wide stimulus. Because unless, you can't think of a color that you have not seen or a shape that doesn't exist. There's a certain finitude to what you can think about. But you come up with your own nuance, you give it your own texture, you join certain dots. So the more richer the stimulus that's there in your subconscious, the grander those connections are, because creativity is all about making disparate connections, unexpected ones. And that's why I think some of the excitement or some of the wonder comes from when you suddenly an idea strikes you. you literally watch those 2 points which until that moment were lying in their own, in their own darkness, suddenly just connect, and then there's like a spark. So in some sense you almost feel like the first reader or the first viewer of the idea than the creator, and then you kind of co-opt with it and then you bring it out to bear in the world. So I
Right.
think a lot of my creativity goes back to those uh, grand, fertile, leisurely periods of childhood where I stumbled through these libraries of books and illustrations. And, I had siblings, like I said. So Priya, my eldest sister, she used to write. And I really looked up. So we would gather, and she was this amazing storyteller. So she had this capacity that even a mundane day she could just go to office and come back, but when we huddled around the dinner table she could tell it with a lot of she could bring in humor and slapstick and then make it mystical. So a very simple, like some Iranian films have this thing where it's just one incident and they take it and then you just watch it unfolding from a different eye, and you see there's a saga even in the most minimal, littlest thing. She had that capacity, so that transported me and it gave me. So I was fortunate in that sense that in an unstructured, unsupervised way to be able to tap into source of creativity, to have people around me who appreciated it, and who could give you the canopy to grow creatively. So in that sense, that's where I think the source of my creativity came from, which is that childhood wonder, sitting on the compound walls and looking at the greenery and stumbling through books, making little illustrations, taking atta from the kitchen when my mom was cooking and making little artifacts out of it, and then conjuring up stories around that, and writing poetry, and we would like read out poetry to each other. And so it was a very fairy tale childhood. So that way I was super fortunate. And I had a family and siblings and that kind of a space. It was not, it wasn't wealthy, or we were not like super well to do. It was like a low middle class kind of upbringing, but I had this creative cocoon, which is so priceless. And by the time I had to collide with the real world, I had already formulated some things in my being about creativity and wonder.
Talk to me about your first venture, and I particularly want to stress on the how did you go from that BSc mathematics, that's such a core subject, from there to creativity? When did the change happen?
So, the thing is, I think creativity was always like a living, breathing thing within me. So, I found recourse because, the way life is, it's intense, it provokes. If you have a creative inclination, that's the antidote to the great catastrophe and the beauty of life. You have a poet's obligation to respond to it in some ways. So irrespective of whether I was doing my mathematics or science or whatever it was, my true secret life in the core of my existence was about having a creative response to life. So just like most other kids, I went through school. I had a reasonably good academic record when I finished my 10th, and by default, you just go by the pathways that are kind of prefixed. So if people think about employment, about a career. So I did my science, I graduated. I when I reached college, I kind of took a slight detour. So I was supposed to do engineering, and I kept feeling that increasingly the creativity that I had bottled up inside me, I felt like I would be happier if I found professional recourse through creative means rather than logical means, because inherently that was where the dominant part of my life and being lay. So even when I was doing my PUC and things like that, I always had this thing, maybe I should go into art, maybe I should try something else. But I didn't have that kind of, a certainty of vision. It was just this hazy restlessness, something where that something is not absolutely right. And deep inside you, there's something that's simmering. And unless you quench that, you're going to be restless. So you have a choice where you either bottle that and bury it in some way so that, that the tremors of restlessness are put to rest, or you have to pull it out and let it see the light of sun. And that always takes time. It's a leap of faith and courage, because it means you don't know which way you're headed. You don't know if there's a profession at the end of it. You don't know what are the implications. So at that point, I had no specific vision, but I certainly had this discontent I would say it was still a healthy discontent. There was no bitterness, no nothing. But certainly I was deeply in touch with the thing that, I wouldn't be happy unless I was doing something creative. And at that point, so I thought I'll take a halfway house instead of doing engineering, for the simple reason that 1 year lesser. So engineering would be 4 years, which I wasted. Here's like 3 years. And, so when I went in, I thought, let me take subjects which I've never taken before. So I chose econometrics, statistics, and by default, maths unfortunately came with that, which wasn't my strong suit. But I thought, hey, okay, at least 2 new subjects. And I thought I'll use those 3 years to explore what I want to do. So just to recap, childhood, where I felt that I wanted to do something creative, and it had its origins and sources there. As I came to PU and so on, I had to. It was a bit of a crossroad, and I always felt like I would be happier doing something creative. So I chose a course which was a little shorter and gave me time to explore, and it was just a stopgap. So I felt like I could pass. I mean, I did a quick survey of the syllabus, and I felt comfortable that it's not a forbidding course, or it won't be too, so thing that I won't be able to explore. So I decided I would take those 3 years to explore things.
Right. Talk to me about the backstory of Rejected Ink. I believe that that's your first venture.
Right. So, when I was doing this BSc mathematics, at that time, one of those creative professions, and, it wasn't, there were things that were pure art, right? And I felt I couldn't do that. I need something which is a halfway house, which can keep the bread and butter on the table, but has creative leanings. So at that point, I took a small course in animation, 2D animation. And animation was something that was an enduring love of mine. From the time I was a child, like we wouldn't have cable TV, but we would get like a couple of hours of cartoons on Saturdays. So DuckTales and Tailspin, all the Disney, Hindi dubbing thing. And for me, that was the pinnacle of the week, right? Because it's a Saturday, it means school is off, and I still have a Sunday and then thing. So when the episode would start, it would be euphoria, and when the episode would wind down, I would feel my heart sink, because school was that much closer and the weekend was on its way out. So that was like the part where, I still remember when the first soundtrack would start. I would feel this sense of exhilaration and sense of being transported, and this sense of wonder. And I always feel indebted to that wonder, which is one of the reasons I called the organization that I've founded now Applied Wonder. I think it goes back to, like, that's the word that I would use to accurately describe that space. So at that point, I did this crash course 2D animation, and I thought maybe I could just do animation as a profession. But as I got deeper into it, I realized that most of the stuff gets outsourced. It's a very labor-intensive thing. So, you don't really create. And I realized I was not a hands person, I was a mind person. And I really liked conceptualizing ideas and inhabiting those stories. And I wasn't too intrigued by the grammar and the sweat and blood of it, the methodology, but rather the psychology and the fragrance of it. And it was a rude shock for me, because I thought, hey, I came here to be a creator, but I'm ending up, just being like a backroom mechanic. I'm fixing, tinkering, and walk cycles and all of it. And at that point, I literally gave up on animation. I thought I would just go into advertising.
When was this?
This was during my BSc. When I was doing it, simultaneously I picked up this crash course to explore and experiment. So the idea was, I try all kinds of things, creative, whatever. So it had to be a profession, it had to be creative. So it's like a thing of bread and butter and things. So I thought advertising is a possibility, copywriting, I could do animation. Maybe, I could even like just try an illustrator's thing. So I become a cartoonist. And so I started interning, dabbling, figuring out things, doing freelance and those kind of things. And what I certainly realized was that I was happier doing stuff by myself and happier conceptualizing things than physically drafting out things. And at that point, I was pretty disappointed with the course and what was happening with the industry and all of it. So I just wound down and I thought, okay, let me just finish my degree. I go into an MBA, and then I'll somehow take a small detour and go into creatives. So that was the plan. And one fine day, much after I'd kind of halfway finished the course and I'd kind of got disappointed and let it go, a friend came home and he gave me this CD. It was just handwritten, the world's greatest animation. I put it into the computer, and I still remember it was about 7:30 in the evening, and this guy went home, and it was a scratch CD, so it keeps getting stuck and everything. So I had to make an image drive and sit and watch it. And until that point, it felt like if you're an individual, you can't create a whole film by yourself, because animation is so labor intensive. Even one walk cycle can take like a person a week to perfect. So if you want to do like a couple of minutes of animation, especially in the nature of the softwares that were available then and the production process that was there, so somebody would have to script it, somebody's storyboarding it, somebody's doing the character design, somebody's taking that and creating like model sheets, animators it goes to, somebody's doing keyframes, somebody's in betweening those keyframes, somebody's cleaning up those things, somebody's coloring it. So it required like an army. So suddenly, for a creative person who got into the industry thinking that he could conceptualize, come up with these films and transport people, it was such a rude shock. And I thought, okay, now what do? I don't have this factory to churn this out. And in that CD were films done by different masters. These were individuals working out of their basements. And what they had done was they had disrupted the production process. So the look and feel in the conventional fare at that time was Disney stuff, which is very neatly cleaned up drawings, and they've got a certain structure and all of it, and that means the production process has to stay true to the way animation had evolved. These guys were people who were doing it frame by frame. So there were people, like almost like impressionist art, where the figures are fading in and out of paper, and you see these shadows and highlights, and somebody else was doing claymation. So Frederick Buck, The Story of the Armchair, The Man Who Planted Trees, Bill Plimpton, who had done Nose Hair, and a couple of other very quirky MTV style stuff. There was cutout animation, there was Harvey Crumpet. And each of these films, completely different style, a different director from a different part of the world. Something made me laugh, something moved me to tears. And in just a couple of minutes, it transported, it truly, the emotions were so conflicting, so different. They were playing me like, and it was surreal. And, I was so immersed in it, it didn't even strike me that it was doing that. And by 3 in the morning, I had seen nearly 15 or 20 of those, and I kept looking at it, and it suddenly opened my mind. I had this feeling that, I'm not limited by resource. These are individuals who are doing stuff. And their vision was so startlingly original that their production process was unique to them. And I just drank that in. And I felt this, I don't know, it's like a minor enlightenment, I would say. And I thought, if it can so powerfully move me, make me laugh, make me reflect, it's just frozen time for me. There's nothing else that I want to do. I thought, what if I could use this for social change? Because, the thing was, you always thought of animation just like this thing for entertainment. It's a children's medium and all of it. But what was happening to me was far more profound. And at that moment, when I was actively there seeking a profession, I thought this was a connection. One of those things, like I said, in creativity, it's about disparate connections. So here's this exquisite children's entertainment kind of a filmmaking medium. And here is my desire for a profession, and I want to do something meaningful and something powerful in the world. And suddenly these things joined. And here's also the answer, that as an individual, you can pull these things off. And that was the origin of Rejected Ink. But the reason it was called Rejected Ink was, because when I was doing the course, what they had promised and what was being delivered, I thought there was a huge dissonance.
You mean the animation
course? Because you go in thinking you're going to be like this, create everything, and then you see this industry setup where you're part of a large cog in the wheel. So I was constantly protesting that they weren't delivering what they were promising. And whenever I wrote scripts, they would say, paisa kaun dega, kaise banaoge, team kahan pe hai? So they kept rejecting the stuff. So I set up the company, and it was called Rejected Ink. So basically, we took all our rejected scripts and we decided we would do stuff. So I had this thing that I would be using animation, and I would be using it in these unconventional formats, and I would actually pursue this dream of creating my own films. And how I would justify that professionally or in terms of employment would be that I would bring it to bear to talk about social causes. Because I felt like animation, at that moment I realized animation is a severely misunderstood medium. It's just seen in a very narrow light, but if you see it in its complete grandeur, its capacity to move, to inspire, to transform is so huge, and there are so many formats. And that was when I set up Rejected Ink, which was my first entrepreneurial venture. And its essence of it was to create animated short films and try and use that for social change. And it was quite an audacious thing because I'd just done some 6 months, not a good animator, not very well trained. I had a bunch of friends who kind of, we hobnobbed in the animation thing. And so I just directly set that up. That was like straight out of college, and I carried into this venture. And I hope to God that it would work out. But in those days, you just have this, you want to give something a shot. You want to give that discontent that you've found some antidote, a possibility. Because if you go too far down the road, you've stopped being true to yourself. And I think for creative people, the thing is that discontent is like it's a call for truth.
Right.
If you bury it for too long, then there's no way back. And that's, it's a devolution. From there's no way back. And I thought that at that point I would take that chance, and I set up Rejected Ink.
It took money to start. It takes money to start a venture. What's the backstory of how did you fund yourself to start that?
Actually, if you want to set up like a small thing like, this podcast,
Right.
it's hardly anything. You guys at least needed hardware. Like we had these old whatever computers that we had and the basic things. And I literally in those days we would draw on paper and scan it and so on. So it wasn't even like I needed heavy hardware. And if once you really want to do something, you figure out. Like I remember the light box, we got it made at Malleshwaram, went to some small carpenter. He thought we were doing some engineering project. So one of my friends designed like the light box itself, and we did it. We just had an acrylic sheet with this peg bar which we got welded somewhere. And
For us who don't know the animation mechanics, what's a light box?
right. So, right now in softwares, you can draw each frame and check how those frames interact, and that's how you figure out the flow. In olden days, what would happen is you need to see multiple frames at one shot. So they had like a little box on which there's a transparent disc illuminated by light from underneath. So you can put the paper on the top, and it's like locked into a peg bar which has got a certain locking mechanism. So that way you can see like 4 to 5 frames, and then you can like sketch to check the continuity. So that's called a light box because it's a box with light underneath and helps you see. But the thing is, it's a heavy duty bulb which gets very hot. So as you keep working, you would see your skin will start peeling off, and it's extremely hot. You have to step away and you get blinded. So really old school. So you rough it out like that. But so to register and things like that, you don't need much. But at that point, I remember there was this contest. I think SS Music was running, and it called animation schools to come up with the interstitial. And they said that whoever won that, they would. So there were prizes. First one was a certain amount of money. You would get like a free, like a discount on certain animation courses, etc. And I had just got out from my animation institute, largely. Partly also because the course finished, and partly because I kept protesting. There was a dissonance, and that's when I set up Rejected Ink. So all these bunch of friends who were from the institute, we got together and we told, okay, let's gloriously attempt taking on all the animation institutes in the country. And so we would just work out of friends' places, and we had this thought for it. And I still remember we didn't even know that you could have a transparency. So we were like trying to draw everything. So it was that nascent. And we actually won the 3rd place. And I think 10,000, if I remember right, was the cash prize. And with that money, we made the light box. We registered the company. And that was like the first money that we had. So I mean, thankfully, my folks didn't have to bankroll me or anything. I took that prize money and set up Rejected Ink.
Now coming to the story of Applied Wonder. What is Applied Wonder, and why is the name Applied Wonder? What does it stand for?
Right. So over the course of, when I started out with the idea that I would use animation for social change, it brought me deeper and closer with the world of social impact and the power of organizations working in that space. Since I was always an ideas person, I migrated from exclusively animation to a more deeper, broader way of using creativity for social change. And that led me into creating communication campaigns, because I realized that films don't work in isolation. Somebody conceptualizes it, and they conceptualize in a context, in a specific need. So I expanded the scope of what I was doing over the course of that decade, since I set up Rejected Ink, and then I ran an enterprise called Center of Gravity, and then that became Applied Wonder. So Applied Wonder is, I would say, it's like the origin is Rejected Ink, and that has manifested as Applied Wonder. Applied Wonder. So right now, what we do, true to its original mission of using creativity for social change, it's an organization that just like people use creativity to sell products and things like that. We do it for socially inspired ideas, businesses, and movements. And we do this in 4 ways. We design brands. People call us for specific campaigns. So there's a specific objective. For example, creating say, selling a product like a copper-based water filter for the bottom of the pyramid, things like that. So it's got a surgical objective, and you figure out how to communicate that in a powerful way. And the core of our work is behavior change communication, which is getting people. So there are maladaptive behaviors like smoking, not washing your hands with soap, etc. And normal advertising goes so far as informing people, inspiring, and so on. But when you have to change behaviors in a fundamental way, in a way that it becomes a norm or it becomes a habit, and you have to go as a counter trend to that, the way that behavior is already formed in people. So how do you inspire them? That requires the use of behavior science. So it's a delicate mix of science and art in that space, where you bring creativity to bear along with behavioral science principles. And that has become the core of our work. And animation, since it started with the Rejected Ink, that's something I've stayed true to. And I've found that it works like a silver bullet, especially in social causes. So that, what do I say, that initial spark of those two disparate dots joining when I saw the world's greatest animation CD, that has manifested in its true form, which is using creative animation for social impact. And so this whole agency is essentially about that, using creativity for social change in all these forms, and still that it's illuminated by animation. And the reason I call it Applied Wonder is, I think wonder is a prerequisite for creativity. It's the space, a capacity to feel, to be awakened, to look at things with a new light. And oftentimes, mostly we work in a kind of a autopilot mode, because you're so inundated by stimulus, and to be provoked to think is very hard. So like Pink Floyd said, you operate from a comfortably numb kind of a space. We are jaded and just with blinkers, and just allowing our mechanisms allow only that much to enter, because it's so exhausting, and there's so much required. So if you have the capacity to wonder, that's a prerequisite, I think, for creativity. And normally when people think of wonder, it's always used in the space of this fairy tale space, like Alice in Wonderland kind of a thing. But since we are a communication firm, I wanted it not just to be this fuzzy, mystical, spiritual, boundless space of wonder, but that it's got a direction, it's got a purpose, it moves things in the world, and it draws as much from science and method as well as from that space of wonder. And therefore, I took applied from applied sciences and yoked it together with wonder. So it's, in that sense, two words which you don't normally see as belonging together, bringing them together in some powerful way, so that there's both magnitude and direction. And that's why that name of Applied Wonder.
The Applied Wonder logo has a rabbit and a melting clock. So what's the significance of a rabbit and a melting clock in the logo?
So two of my favorite, creative sources, one is Salvador Dali and the other Alice in Wonderland. So the rabbit comes from that, and the thought of going down the rabbit hole. For me, that's been like, as a personal journey, it's exactly been that way. And this wonder came, and I, in some sense, I'm seduced by it, and then I followed down this rabbit hole, and it's been like a mad journey full of ups and downs, and taken me through this wild thing of entrepreneurship and behavior science and evolutionary biology and campaign design and filmmaking and it's come with all its implications on the professional front, on the personal front, and all of it. And therefore, I thought that that emblematic thing of this, that the rabbit embodies that. And I don't think there's any other in literature or in, it's truly one of those, it's a unique idea itself. So Alice in Wonderland was something very dear to me as a child. I would spend hours because it's such unexpected creativity. It takes you in tangential ways. And I just couldn't grasp it in some ways. How does somebody think that way? And that's something that, I pursued actively. I like the absurdist, mystical kind of a thing. And you'll see in a lot of my illustrations, it's reflected. So that's the source code is Alice in Wonderland. And Dali, similarly, he took it to a surrealist, poetic, mystical level. So both these, and that's why the melting clock. And I think and I'm sure most people will agree that when you're very immersed in something, the nature of time alters. And particularly so when you're doing something creative, because, you can't have a metronome working in your mind and be immersed. So immersion itself means that time becomes flaccid. So I really liked the idea of, inviting people to go down the rabbit hole and to forget time. So one is about space, one is about time. And with applied sciences and wonder from that original thing of creativity, it became like a very powerful way to invite people into this world that's applied wonder.
I think that is a segue from being a scalar quantity to a vector, having some sort of direction. Is that what you tried there?
Yeah, since I did my bachelor's in mathematics, sometimes I like to draw from that. So that's as far as I got. So I would always say that wonder is like the scalar quantity, which is all magnitude. It's not about direction. And
Right.
we are about communication, which is both about magnitude and direction. So like a vector version of that.
You said the core of applied wonders work is in behavior science and behavior change communication. How did you stumble upon the behavior science frameworks or the behavior centered design?
So when I migrated from Rejected Inc. into an organization called Center of Gravity, and right through I've always been an entrepreneur, so I was a founder there. And there, our idea was to use advertising and communication, and we still were pursuing social change. During the course of that, in around, I think it was 2012 or 2013, I don't remember precisely, we had an opportunity to work with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So there were these behavioral scientists, some epidemiologists, evolutionary biologists, all of who came together, and they were trying to postulate a theory on how to change behavior. Because it's a bit of a holy grail in communication, like there are doctors who know smoking is bad but continue smoking. There's something that even about if you educate people, they have the knowledge, it's hard to transform behaviors that are ossified. And that means millions of children die due to diarrhea because moms don't wash their hands with soap. It means smokers are getting cancer and they can't resist it in spite of knowing it's going to be harmful for them in the long run. So for long, we have been wondering, why do we do what we do? And what we do is more important than what we say. So it's a very fundamental question. And these scientists had really gone into the source code of the origins of behavior from an evolutionary lens. And their thing was, if you were to look at it from the lens of psychology, my psychology varies from yours. It's a very, it's very individual specific. It moves over time. You can't grasp it in a kind of a clear parenthesis. It's not a tangible thing. Psychology is one of those things that's a lot of moving plates, and there are a lot of abstract areas, still a nascent field. If you took it from a sociological lens, if you were to do a campaign that works in Afghanistan, it may not work in Nepal. What you do in Nepal may not work in Karnataka. So, there's a perpetual thing of how do you first change behavior? Why do we do what we do? What are its origins? And then what kind of a lens can you take for both utility and validity? So these guys had gone and studied it from an evolutionary lens, because they said if you could understand the way behavior manifested and the way it's evolved into us, hardwired into our neurology, into our biology, then we could move those levers and change behaviors. So they came and they briefed us. So it was almost done like a scientific experiment, where in 7 villages you deploy this campaign, in 7 villages you do not, and there's a controlled study between is there a variance. So based on their theories, we had to come up with a campaign. Now until that point, you did creativity blue sky. At best, you did some consumer research, you came up with insights, and all of that. But for me, it was so illuminating because for the first time, I suddenly realized when I looked back from the lens of what they were talking, that I could see why certain campaigns work and why they didn't. And
Right.
that was the first moment where I started understanding the validity and the salience and the power of behavior science, and what are those pieces that move us, and how I can top up communication onto that. And I thought that was such a and initially when I started doing it, because these things seem very simple, everybody has a point of view on these things, and even I had that creative arrogance. I just thought I could come up with a really smart creative, and people would remember it, and it would be one of those award-winning things, and hand washing would change. That was not true. I realized that so when communication is based on a motivational lever, it's far more likely to change behavior than just being creative or being a cognitive proposition. And it took a long time for the penny to drop, because I kept designing it and so on. And when you actually watch it working in the world, over time, you start joining the dots about what's working, what's the theory, how is it manifesting, and you start comparing it with what you were doing earlier and what is happening on the ground. So that was the first time where I understood that there are things that go deeper when it comes to behavior, and that it's dominantly subconscious, dominantly evolutionary. And unless you create communication based on those principles, unless science is illuminating your creativity, it will not change behaviors. And I saw it because it was literally tested, we researched, and it took nearly a year for that campaign to manifest. And so that was the first threshold moment for me where I crossed into that.
What was the campaign about? What was the brief that was given to you?
So the brief was as follows, which is, can you, without using the word germs or without using the word diarrhea, change hand washing behavior in a rural setting, which is kind of media dark? And the baseline at that point was about 1% in some places, about 3% in other places. And we had to come up with this communication campaign based on the theories that they had. They would deploy it, and then they would test it over a period of 3 months, then 6 months, a year, to see what was the delta, and whether it went up, went down, what was the attrition, things like that. And the reason, so the whole premise of this theory is, so there are multiple parts to it, but I'll talk about one core element, because if I talk about the whole theory, there are various pieces. Right. So the idea is this, that if you go back and look at the way behavior has evolved in us as a species, so it goes right from the amoeba till us, and they found that 3 mechanisms or 3 behavior production mechanisms evolved in the brain over the evolutionary cycle. The first is the reflexive brain, and that's where your habits lie, conditioned automatisms. And so most of our behavior happens subconsciously. That's, the kind of thing like when a high beam hits your eye, you flinch, you don't think about that.
That's the system 1.
System 1.
Yeah.
So in behavioral economics, they say system 1 and system 2, which is system 1 is what you do almost unthinkingly. It's spontaneous, immediate, reflexive, and so on. The system 2 is the more slow considered kind of space that you operate from. But what these guys found is that there were 3 levels of the brain, not just those 2 levels, which is the system 1, system 2. And the second level they call the motivated brain. They found there are 15 fundamental evolutionary motives that drive human behavior. These are irrational. They're called behavior production units. So the desire to nurture, lust as a drive, curiosity, play, justice, status, all these things, even when I just tell that word, that it's universal. The desire for status is going to be there whether you're a celebrity or whether you're in Africa or in some other place. That the nurturing mother, the archetype of it, is a universal phenomenon, whether it's, somewhere in the souks of Morocco or if it's in a thing of London. It's a universal thing. Lust, everybody has it. That's there as a drive play, curiosity. It's there in kittens, it's there in young children, it's still there in us. So these are universal motives, and the power of this theory, or it was, I wouldn't even say theory, like, because there's absolute continuity scientifically speaking. These are not just born in a vacuum that, hey, let's come up with status. So they had figured out the path of how it evolved and what's the operative mechanism. For example, status, it goes back to silverback gorillas. So when a gorilla becomes, it becomes like the head of the tribe, that becomes the leader. So that's the alpha male. Over time, there are changes apparently that happen in its body. So it sprouts a silverback. So that's the only gorilla that gets that. And, that's why silver hair is seen as a sign of experience and status and so on. So it goes back like that. They've mapped it in a very robust, there's continuity in that. It's not something that's a theory in that sense. It's not a hypothesis. And so actually the third level is, I would say the equivalent of system 2, which is more the executive function, which is once you're motivated, you actually start planning on how to enact out that behavior. So those are the 3 levels of the evolutionary brain that we are working with. And normally when behavioral economics works on creating campaigns, they try to nudge the first level, which is subconsciously orchestrate behavior in some way. So the person, they don't even know, but they start doing the right behavior.
Any examples of that?
So one famous example is organ donation. In Europe, they found that among various countries, 2 countries, the organ donation was much lower than others. And that was a kind of a mystery because, culturally they're pretty similar, education-wise, socio-economic. So why is it that only in these 2 countries that the organ donation is low? And when they finally looked at the forms, they realized that in the other countries where the organ donation was much higher, by default, it was ticked. Okay. In these 2 countries, you had to think about it. So you go into the executive function. The moment you go into the executive function, you're thinking, oh God, my organ is going to be taken out. Maybe I'm getting dismembered. Then you think of death, this, that. You don't want to confront it. So you say no. The moment they switched the form and made it a default, because default means, you always want to have maximum profit with the least expenditure of energy. So that's the idea of the system 1, which is autopilot. Everything is known, so you don't have to spend too much energy figuring out how to navigate, come up with new rules, all of that.
Right. Now going to system 2, what would be the examples of that?
So system 2 is, for example, most of the advertising or storytelling and all of it, you'll notice that even, you look at certain products. Actually, if you look at branding, it basically there's a product with a particular logo, and that logo gives all the premiums. And that means that you're accruing such an idea to something symbolic that you're willing to spend your resources on that. And that tells a certain thing about you. If somebody's using an apple, it means he's a particular kind of a personality. So that is like you accrue some status by what brands you possess, and therefore you pay the premiums. So communication that triggers motives, stories that trigger motives, that's a good example of it. So whenever, that's what we did in Superama. It was the idea of, to make mothers wash hands with soap. We told a story about, it was told from a child's point of view about this mother who does the normal things that all our mothers do, but it's framed in this almost like an everyday fable. Children have this capacity. Sometimes they see adults and they hero worship. They have a certain purity. And so it's this child looking at the mom going about her chores in the village, doing her thing, and how, whatever she does brings him up, and eventually he succeeds. And in retrospect, he sees that this constellation of things that his mom instilled in him, how that led to his success. And one among the various things was also hand washing. And hand washing, actually, we found lies not in the area of health, it lies in the area of good manners and hygiene. The thing is, the mothers want their children to look well groomed so that when they succeed, people can see that's a code of success. So when you tell a story which is about nurturing, you don't have to go into the pathway of there are germs on your hand which go into your mouth, that goes into your stomach, and then that makes you sick, and that leads to thing. And when you do that, what happens is people all agree, yeah, so we should wash hands with soap. But because it goes into the executive function, people all agree, but they don't do it, because actually behavior is not produced in the executive function dominantly. It's more dominantly produced in the system, in the reflexive and in the motivated brain. So that was why they told us not to use the word germs or not to use the word diarrhea, because then it would be about outcomes, it could be about process, it would be about the mechanism, never about the emotion. So essentially, we told a story which had nothing to do with the mechanics of what we were trying to, tell them. So it was not about education, it was about triggering the right, the domain motive that creates that behavior. And that was the fundamental creative that we came up with. And when you create, when advertising triggers that or communication triggers that, that's when behavior actually alters. So essentially, you go back to those 15 source motives, and that's what manufactures behavior. And then you top it up with the creative in a way that it delivers. So the creative gets people's attention, it entertains them, it creates, it becomes salient in their consciousness. And then as it unpacks, it goes and triggers the motivational lever. That motivational lever is like the thing that manufactures the behavior. And when it goes and triggers that, it gets into the source code and starts altering the behavior.
Right.
And why that has, in my view, greater validity than some of the nudges and things like that. When you use nudges, you almost are getting people to change their behavior without their knowledge. Like when you move it to a default tick, they're not even aware of it. So always in public health and other spaces, there's ethical questions. If you don't know that I'm changing your behavior, but I'm changing your behavior, what is the limit to that? The second thing is, the moment you know that they're doing this to you, then, all of us have had some credit card where they put a tick on the subscription and without your knowledge it gets thing. The next time you're furious, you kick out the brand and you unclick that subscribe thing. So the moment it comes from your reflexive into your executive, then the validity of that nudge gets diluted. But when you trigger the motivational brain, which is the source code of these irrational emotions that drive us, what that means is, of your own volition, for the right reasons, you're motivated. And that means that it's voluntary, it's conscious, it's doing it in a way that's powerful, it's using storytelling and so on. And it ensures that even if there are barriers to the performance of the behavior, your motivation takes you beyond those barriers. If not, you have to create like a whole orchestrated thing where, you remove barriers, you ensure that there are rewards, reminders, all of that. So essentially, if you're motivated, then that fixes a lot of the problems that other mechanisms of communication or other means or other frameworks of campaign design cannot address.
Right. So is it safe to assume that knowledge is not equal to behavior?
Yes, I would say that's dominantly true. Like education and so on has a certain, validity in communication, but not as much as it's made out to be. In the sense that if there's already a pre-felt need, say there's a pandemic and people don't know what to do, if you go out and tell them that, look, you should be doing this, then there's a chance 5 or 10% may convert. So it has a certain validity, but it's highly overstated, misunderstood, misused. Actually the thing is, if you trigger the emotions, far more likelihood that you'll get much deeper, irreversible, continuous, universal change of maladaptive behaviors.
So Superama was the campaign that you had designed for the London School of Hygiene, right?
Yeah.
So this is an inherent nature of creative people, that they get attached to their ideas. And I have a couple of questions on that front. But before I get there, I want to ask you that how do you position yourself when you have no experience? Because let's say the behavior science, the scientists are talking to you, you're going back to them with a creative campaign based on the research that they have done. But you don't have any experience in behavior science. So to put it across, how do you position yourself when you're just starting out?
So I think the thing is, you draw strength from authenticity of ideation. There's no other antidote, because you cannot be outsourcing building, getting people to see the beauty of your idea to experience or credentials or things like that. Even now, it's like 15-20 years into the field, I never draw from the thing of experience primarily. If I really feel it's a beautiful idea, the complete moral force of that, and I try to come up with an idea, because they are scientists but I'm a creative person, So in that sense, they can come up to the point of telling nurtures the motive, but I have the responsibility and the capacity to take the leap from nurture to superama, and that's only something which I can do. So in that sense, both of us are peers at some level. And obviously they come in with all the mechanics of the science and everything. My thing is to really appreciate it, absorb it, interpret it, internalize it, synthesize it, and manifest it into so authentic a creative that I feel morally that I have the force to put it in front of them and to back that idea. So whether you're completely a fresher or whether you're an experienced person, I think the moral force in putting a creative idea in front of your audience or whomever you wish to speak to only comes from if you feel that, just at source when you come with the idea that it's not a fabrication, it's not just a smart, you're not just just moving pieces around. It's something that's erupting from a deep place, a pure place, and you believe it works. You just back yourself and go with it. Because people, they, even that's what behavior science says, that we are not as rational eventually when we make decisions. We go by emotions. And when you see that somebody is coming to you from a pure place and there's a certain component of the vision that they are seeing which you're not, people will be attracted to that. People will give you the, they will pull their guard down. So I never try to sell per se. There are no methods and tips and tricks. I just try to come up with an idea that I feel is powerful enough, and I hope that it will echo and resonate with whomever I'm speaking to.
So basically being very truthful, being very, very real, I guess, in some sense. You're just putting it out, and that's what you feel is the best way to put it out. So that brings to my next question, which is the way creative people think or the way they put across their thoughts. Those are two different things. So creativity is one part of it, but the other part is the articulation side of it. And having known you from several years, you are one of the most articulate person that I have ever come across. So for anyone who is watching this episode and who is a creative person but lack articulation, how do they go about being more articulate?
So, I think I always was an introvert. Like I was homeschooled till third. The first time I collided with the real world, it almost took me, I was shocked because my language is almost Victorian, Shakespearean, and the way the schools and the systems and the apparatus. So I shied away from the spotlight. Till today, I don't like to be the articulate person. I prefer that. In fact, in Center of Gravity, I never sold. I would just come, present my idea and leave. I hermetically seal myself away from clients, from research. I don't, during the pandemic, I was perfectly happy because I could sit by myself at home. I didn't have to catch early morning flights, didn't have to sit in meetings. It was perfectly in line with what I am as a person. But the only reason I hazard what it means to be articulate is to be vulnerable in some ways. You're putting yourself out there and you're hazarding the risk that as the words are forming and as your thoughts are formulating in front of people,
Right.
that you will be judged. If you let go of that fear, and that you cannot let go of that fear easily.
Yeah.
You can let go of that fear only if something so important that you know that only you can deliver that thing. So you take it upon yourself as a certain martyrdom and a certain suffering and a certain courage that you need to think. And it won't come easily. You'll fail many times, you'll feel miserable, you'll stumble in front of people, all of that. So two things will happen. One is you build your capacity to articulate because it's about language, it's about putting ideas in a certain sequence and figuring out what's the way to do storytelling in a way that's authentic. So you will work on that. And how you work on that is you look at sources, you look at good speakers, you read books, you try to put yourself out there and in the real world try to see how to articulate better. Because especially in the kind of profession that I am, it's partly about the creative itself. It's also about interpreting briefs and getting people to co-opt into that idea so that its vision doesn't get diluted or cramped. So you work on that in some ways. So that is the effort part of it. And I wouldn't recommend like a systematic, like, I read so many books, things like that.
Not a listicle, do 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Never. The thing is, you have to do it out of that need or the passion to do it. And you should be able to, irrespective of the outcome, start being able to appreciate turns of phrases, watching people who articulate. And there are people who weaponize it. There are articulators for the sake of articulation. So you'll have to take all that with a pinch of salt. You just absorb it, give it its own time. It may take 3-4 years, 5 years, whatever. But never be discouraged, never link it to outcomes, because discouragement comes from, oh, I'm not yet articulate enough compared to A, say A or B. But you will find that, if you keep putting in, absorbing and exposing yourself to that stimulus, it's inevitable after a point, it will start getting its own energy and impetus. You will start being able to, without effortlessly, the words will start coming in, because there's so much, it's like this thing that's growing in your subconscious. If not, you don't even know how to do it. So the how is taken care of by exposing yourself to stimulus and spending time. And the courage is taken care of by the passion, which is, you have this idea or you have this entrepreneurial vision. Then whether you're fragile, whether you're introverted, whether you're broken, vulnerable, traumatized, you will get the courage by the idea, not by yourself.
So you mentioned the word stimulus. I want to unpack it even further. When you say that there are instances when you want to be more articulate, what are those instances? Because everyday conversations, no one would try to put efforts into being more articulate. So what are these instances that people can try being more articulate?
So I think the first thing is articulation for the sake of articulation is something that I think that's not the way to approach it. Articulation essentially means to have a grasp of language, to be in touch with your emotions, and then to bring that to bear in the most appropriate way. So, 3 components to it. One is being in touch with what you're feeling, and to if you're too opaque to yourself, then you don't know exactly what you want to say. So try and be in touch with what you want to say and what your emotions are, and so that you're transparent to yourself. Next thing is to find the right language, and that means reading and listening. So you read as many books, you read articles, you try to see how they're formulating the words, how they're formulating the sentences, how that is manifesting as paragraphs, how that's manifesting as a narrative. So you appreciate that, and you don't do it to become more articulate, but you do it because it's beautiful and it's done in such a considered way. Second thing is listening to articulate people and absorbing how they formulate their thoughts, the cadence of their voice, the way they bring it all together. When you appreciate that, then all that starts enabling you in some ways. And you don't set a time limit, you don't set an objective, but you do it because it's an opportunity that you can read all these great minds, you can listen to these great speakers. Right now with the internet, you have so much of stimulus available. So whatever is the subject that interests you, you actively seek out the best minds in that space. And then you just listen, absorb. You have to be a hoarder of these things. You put it away somewhere at the back of your subconscious. Then over time, if you have emotions that you want to convey, and then you have been appreciating the means and the mechanism to convey that, it's inevitable that you will become articulate over time, and you will do it in your own way. Because that's the point, that instead of replicating or finding formulas and so on, you just feed that entity that wants to speak out, that's hidden inside you. Then over time it will find its own voice.
So far the conversation has been around how creative people can do justice to their own thoughts. But I want to take a step backwards and see if is there a way to become more creative? Or I think I should also rephrase the question into, are people already creative? Or is creativity a skill that can be inculcated?
So it would partly depend on how you're defining creativity. In the sense, there's the retail everyday creativity, which is moms when cooking, parents figuring out smart ways to get their children to do things, the kind of things that kids do as they're exploring stuff. the jokes that happen at coffee tables, friends cracking, the kind of coffee table humor that happens. So all that's like a retail creativity. Then there's a higher order creativity, which is a little more organized, little more deeper. So then you talk of the artists. So that's a visionary space, and I think uh, that's not something that's universal. That's not democratic. There's a component to it that might be democratic, but the source of it, it's not something that everybody possesses. It goes into their own childhood, how they grew up, what their sources of inspiration were, and a certain innate capacity. So I don't think creativity is universal in that way. Having, being in the profession, having worked with a lot of creative people, I found that there's a certain degree to which people can be taught, and a lot of people are truly bestowed. You physically, palpably see that you cannot do what they're doing. They almost seem to be channeling that space and seem to innately have that capacity. So I think you can hone things, you can improve things, you can move things up by notches, but I don't think you can transform a completely non-creative person into a completely into having that 440 volts of creativity. So you can teach people the method, you can teach people frameworks, you can help them appreciate things, you can give them a lot of uh, stimulus so that their consciousness is populated with possibilities of how to be creative. But then there has to be one leap which is innate, which is how do you come up with an idea spontaneously. So I think physical creativity, which has got certain frameworks and layout, typography, color schemes, the best way to use graphite pencils and create shadows and highlights, all of those kind of things can be taught. But the final creative leap is your own individual thing, and that's, I think, like a possible, like it goes very, very deep. It's something partly innate and partly learned.
Right. What I have seen in the past, when talking to creative people, and now that I'm around a lot of creative people, they get attached to their ideas. And also, that brings me to my next question, which is detachment good? And if so, how to do it?
So I think, invariably creativity comes from who you are as a person, and who you are is an aggregation of things. So it comes from an identity, an ego, a private vision, or nuance. So it's inevitably will be attached to what you come up with, because unless it comes from that wellspring of emotions which belong to you, uh, an idea cannot happen. If you're completely, if it's something that you're not concerned with, you don't feel anything about, it's very hard for an idea to happen. So at the point of emergence, there's always a thing that it comes from your ego and from your identity and from within the confines of it. But the moment it gets out in the world, I think one has to cultivate, and it's almost like a spiritual thing and a matter of discipline, where you distance yourself from the outcome of that. So you need dispassion when it's actually already out. You need passion to create, and you need dispassion for it to work in the world. If not, you get hurt, because you get so attached to are people liking that idea, is that succeeding, did the client buy it, are people appreciating that the idea is working. That's not a healthy space to be in. So yeah.
But Jay, when you think about the detachment part, we risk not being completely involved, right? So somewhere down the line, I feel that we might lose depth in our creativity if we were to think of detachment that way. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's the thing, that you do it passionately when you're creating, conceptualizing, all of that. So till you bring it into the world and it's final and you put the finishing touches, you do it with absolute passion. After that, you have to cultivate some psychological dispassion to only the outcome. So to the product, to the creation, you do it with your complete intensity. Then you're not hostage to extrinsic factors and post hoc factors. So you do your thing. In fact, I would say that if you're completely passionate about something, it won't matter about how people perceive it or how it ends up. So that's all I am advocating, which is when you're creating it, you do it, and you do it with absolute intensity, and the details are sacrosanct, all of that. And hopefully you do it in a way that's productive, and uh, it's gentle on you and people around you, because a lot of times creativity people take it overboard, where they burn themselves and others around, and they have this private vision and they digest that's a catabolic way of using creativity. Hopefully it's a productive, gentle, exquisite way where you're healed in the creation of it. Obviously that's like an idealistic way of looking at it, but the simple answer is passion during creation, dispassion on outcome.
I think that's a nice way to summarize that topic. One more thing that I have seen in creative people is that they don't want to do it for money, but they are conditioned to do it for money. And you could see stark differences in their work when it's a paid work and then once it is a personal work. So, in this world of this whole culture of monetizing what you are good at, what are your thoughts on it? Do creative people have to monetize their skill, or how do they go about their creativity then?
So, in my view, I've tried to keep the distance between the creativity that I'm chasing and what I'm doing to keep the bread and butter on the table as close together as possible. That way, there's alignment between your interests, your philosophy, your ethos, and the outputs that you're creating. Oftentimes, that's like the most ideal thing, which is your heart and what your needs are, that's in complete alignment. If that's not possible, obviously there are points where people are doing things for the money and so on, and that's necessary, because if it's not sustainable, you can't keep that going. And it's non-ideal that you have to give up on your creativity for economic reasons in the long term. So the maximal happiness you're going to have if you're doing your creativity in a way that's durable and sustainable. So actually that's also a creative question, which
Right.
is, how do you, in a way that actually gets the bread and butter on the table, not sell out and stay true to your creative vision? So if you don't solve that meta creative question, then the subset questions are, how do you come up with a song, or how do you write a poem, how do you monetize it? So you need to do both of those things. So I think it's important for creative people to find a way to sustain themselves, and in a way that's authentic. And it depends on each person and their lives and their circumstance and their opportunities. But that's a creative question in itself.
Got it. Now I want to slightly switch gears and talk about one case study that I have been super excited to talk to you about. Mom's Magic Hands. 25 plus countries, 800,000 people it has reached, and 70% behavior change. That's stellar. Please tell us what the brief was in that and what the campaign did. I already told that, but how did you achieve those figures?
Right. So the MMH is a behavior change campaign to increase hand washing in emergency settings. I was based on Suprama. We were called upon to create a campaign, and they wanted to create something which was a universal template where they could take it across geographies and across different cultures, and that was the mandate. When we were working on that campaign, there was an earthquake in Nepal, and in almost an emergency way, we had to create a campaign. We had to adapt that campaign because in refugee camps, obviously the mortality can be higher because the circumstances are such, the hygiene markers, everything go down. It's a lot of trauma, a lot of chaos, and so on. So based on the Suprama kind of a template, which was, we know that nurture is like a good motivational lever for moms, we had to come up with a campaign. And so I came up with this idea that, so if you think about hand washing, the hands are the central protagonist of it.
Right.
And you know that the evolutionary motive is nurture. So if you marry both of those, this was the creative leap that I took. I said that mom's hands have a certain magic. And, like every child feels that, mother's cooking is best when you're in pain, always assuaged by your mom. There's something about the mother's touch. It's almost the embodiment, like the physiological vibration of nurture is captured in the mother's touch. And so the central thought of that was mom's magic hands. And it's the story of a child in this refugee camp. And, in refugee camps, all society is disrupted. So the people that you can look up to are just your parents in some ways. So it's the story of this mother who's nurturing her child, and it's always written about how the mother's magic touch guides her through that chaos and trauma. And then she goes through the refugee camp, grows up, succeeds, heals, and then comes back and looks after the mother. But essentially, just this idea that mums have a certain magic in their hands, and we link that to the act of hand washing. Because when your hands are clean, you're looking after the child, you feed it, and so on, it nurtures and grows. And it's almost like partly through the magic and partly through the nutrition, the child is getting healthier and succeeding, and so on. And when you don't wash your hands, the germs go, the child falls sick, then the magic is not working the way it should. It literally drops. So it was like this abstract connection of the idea that mom's hands have a magic based on the evolutionary motive of nurture, linking it to the act of hand washing. And so this moving, hopeful story of a child in the refugee camp and how the mother's touch heals her and takes her out of that chaos, that became the central core piece of that campaign. And we strategically built, based on the three levels of the brain, a cascade of small activities that could be done with limited production where you don't have control on the settings and so on. So we almost built it like a buffet where you can pick and choose which activity you want and you can deploy it, because in emergency settings you don't have a control on who's deploying it, what kind of production facilities and so on. And that worked beautifully in Nepal, and that has been extrapolated, and Oxfam uses it, UNHRC has used it, so it's gone across 25 countries, 800,000 women it has reached. So everything from refugee camps to during COVID in Africa, in Syrian refugees. So that's the point, that when you go that deep into the evolutionary source code, so you're talking about nurture, and you come up with the idea that's so universal that moms have a certain magic in their hands. It's working across, that's a refugee camp from a Muslim kind of a background nation like Syria, or it's working in Nepal, which is like a completely different demographic. That is the power of the behavior centered design. When you go that deep into the source code and you tell stories that are so universal, then it truly transforms. And 70% behavior change is kind of incredible. That means a story is saving lives in emergency settings and giving people hope where everything has been disrupted and lost. So that's pretty much like a small nutshell essence of Mom's Magic Hands.
What's the most satisfying part of your job?
I would say, actually just running Applied Wonder, that if you think about it, when I was very young, I had this vision of using creativity for social change, and I wanted to do it through animation. And I've gone through this chaotic journey, and as an entrepreneur who's chasing this kind of an oblique vision, you go through a lot of near-death experiences. So I've had, times of crisis, I've had times of heroism and resurrection, all of that. And just to think that every day I walk into a space and we are a very small team doing something where you're telling stories and using creativity that actually creates social change. So there's like a perpetual everyday sense of satisfaction. It's not a euphoria, it's like a gentle or tethered, humble satisfaction, because there's a certain degree of validity to it. So within that, obviously, every time there's a great campaign that comes out, you feel this joy. But at the end of the day, it's not even the impact or the thing, but just it's so amazing that you had a vision of that nature and that the cosmos has conspired in spite of your inadequacies to be able to live that day in, day out. And that, the purest part of you can talk to, say, a mother in a refugee camp in Syria, or to a village in Andhra Pradesh, or to some old person in Africa. And you can use that to create some social change. It's a perpetual sense of gentle satisfaction, and I'm always grateful for it. And when you're an entrepreneur like I am, at the scale that I operate, half the time I don't know where the business comes from. So it's like being a tightrope walker where you don't know the beginning nor the end, because the idea just, sometimes it just crackles into your consciousness. You don't know where it comes from. You're almost grateful. You hope that you get a great idea as the timeline and the deadline is coming towards you. At the same time, you don't exactly know how the business manifests, because obviously you have your methodologies and you try various things, you build the brand, all of it. But I have a healthy respect for the serendipity and the grandeur of grace behind it. Uh, so yeah, I'm grateful, and there's a constant sense of satisfaction from that, because life, it's hard, and if you're not doing something that it gives you a sense of meaning to wake up and take on life, that's a very hard place to be in. So at least that I've chased that in whatever way through all the chaos, and I'm doing what I'm doing, so I'm grateful and satisfied with that.
So what are your future aspirations for Applied Wonder?
Actually, I just I'm pretty happy with what Applied Wonder is. It's a complete manifestation of that primary vision. So I think our job is just to stay alive and do what we do with absolute purity. The work is so unique, so powerful, and so deeply informed by science and creativity and in the space of social impact. If we just do what we do at whatever scale that we are doing, if we create like 10 mmhs or programs of that nature, we would have done something that begets legacy, that's transformed the world and so on in our own small humble way. So I don't have any an ambition in terms of scale, or in terms of even scale of impact. I just want us to hopefully stay alive and stay pure. I think everything else will fall in place.
I think the act of doing itself is the reward and not the result.
Absolutely. That's why I said the passion during creation and dispassion during outcome. That's true about organization as well as an idea. So the passion comes from, there's this brief and you're thinking, how do you crack it? And, what's the source, what's the source operative mechanism, and how is this going to think? So that gives you a joy when that idea comes. You brainstorm and you watch it happen. You watch it come to life. You look at the printouts and the translations and the voiceover artists and all of that. And that itself is it's so full of life and so riveting, so beautiful. That has its own reward. And then the dispassion is okay, the bread and butter happens, or the impact happens. Ultimately, that's like beyond your control. What you can do, the locus of control that you have, is to be authentic, to be pure, to be as creative, and to be as professional as possible. So yeah,
I think we have reached the end of the interview. But before ending, I always had this dream to listen to the poets in their own original voices. And I have your book here, and I would just request you to read out one poem for us.
Okay, sure. You can give me the book and I'll read something for you.
Please.
Although, the voice that you read in and the voice that you write are very different. So long one, short one. How much time?
No, please, feel free. But also do let us know why you wrote it.
Okay. There are a lot of ones that I like. It's kind of hard to choose. Okay, give me some thematic.
Okay. I think the perfume vial one.
The perfume one.
Yeah.
Okay. This is not a poem.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a poem called This Is Not a Poem. This is not a poem but a misunderstood flower lost on a platform where the trains only go into autumn. This is not a poem but a dilapidated city where no one will ever again remember to hum. This is not a poem but a toy on a voyage to a land where there are no children. This is not a poem but a museum of statues whose hearts are all broken. This is not a poem but a spider lost in a web so large he may never weave dreams again. This is not a poem but an umbrella who occasionally comes alive only to cry in the rain. This is not a poem but a trove of diamonds sealed in with dried blood. This is not a poem but a lullaby digging to come out from beneath the mud. This is not a poem but the confessions of a gun leaning in an abandoned box. This is not a poem but the restless rustling of a suitcase full of orphaned frocks. This is not a poem but a ballet dancer dancing in a field of landmines. This is not a poem but the ashes of a springtime of dragonflies. This is not a poem but a broken mirror doing its obligation of reflecting the world's pains. This is not a poem but the chronicles of a paradise lost of an Eden's remains. This is not a poem but a swan sailing out to heal the world when it cries in its sleep. This is not a poem but a necklace of nectar out to sweeten the tears of grief. This is not a poem, but an armada of paper boats setting out with its cargo of reveries. This is not a poem, but an ocean of butterflies ushering in the tides of peace. This is not a poem. So the primary thought of this, there's like a little prose piece that explains why. So no poem is a poem alone. No song is just a song. It's also the whole of music. No memory is just itself. It's the fragrance of a whole lifetime disguised as one incident. So, the thought is that you don't write just for those lines. There's actually, it looks like a set of words, but it's like this emotions and the state of the world and what needs to be done in the world, the poet's obligation. So that's why, whenever you write a poem, it's not just a poem itself, it's several things. And thereby, like each of those pieces, like this is not a poem but a misunderstood flower lost on a platform where the trains only go into autumn. So the idea of misunderstood flower is a lot of creative people are very sensitive, they wilt, and they're kind of misunderstood. So it's this idea, for example, the first two lines, this is not a poem. Actually, you think it's just a poem, but it's actually the song of a creative person who's so sensitive, who'll wilt like a flower and who's misunderstood. And trains only go into autumn. So it's this, imagine this empty platform where there is this one wilting, fragile person, and its destiny is only to go towards wilting, not flowering. And that's the pain a creative person feels when he's there and his dreams haven't manifested. So that's why that line. Oh, this is not a poem but a dilapidated city where no one will ever again remember to hum. So, like war-torn cities, like now what's happening in Ukraine and so on. At one moment it's full of life and there are people, it's, you use the word humming with life. A dilapidated city where no one will ever again remember to hum, which is the music is extinguished in you. So it's about that space that some of those cities, sometimes it's in a geography, but sometimes it's inside you. So like that, each of those lines are about that space. And that's why this thought of this is not a poem.
Jay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to the show. Yeah, I think we are done here.
Okay, good. Thank you.